There is a sound the ocean makes at night, not the crash of waves against stone, not the rush of tide pulling back from sand. Something older than that, something beneath the surface. A low hum that exists in the space between water and air, between waking and rest. If you listen long enough, the rhythm begins to feel familiar, not because you have heard it before, but because it moves at the same pace as breath, the same pace as thought, when thought begins to slow. The ocean does not hurry, it does not arrive and then leave. It simply continues, and in that continuation there is room to drift, room to let go of the need to understand. Tonight, we are standing at the edge of that water. The sky above is dark, not with storm, but with the kind of darkness that comes when the day has fully released its claim. Stars scatter across the black, distant and cold, but the ocean reflects nothing. It holds its own light somewhere far below, where no one can see. This is where we begin, not on land, not in a library or a lecture hall, not with maps spread across tables or theories debated under bright lights. We begin here, at the edge, where the world becomes uncertain and the water asks nothing of us, except that we listen. There is a place the ocean remembers, not a place you can sail to, not a place marked on any chart. It exists the way a dream exists, after waking, present in feeling, absent in form. You cannot touch it, but you know it was there. You cannot return to it, but it shaped you nonetheless. The place has a name, though the name carries more weight than meaning. Atlantis. Not the Atlantis of treasure hunters and conspiracy videos. Not the Atlantis of documentaries that promise revelation in the final minutes. This is something quieter, something older, a memory held by water. Story that has survived not because it is true, but because it is necessary. We are not here to find Atlantis. We are here to drift toward it, to let the water carry us in the direction of something lost, to move slowly enough that the journey becomes indistinguishable from rest, because perhaps that is what Atlantis has always been. Not a destination, not a mystery to solve, but a place we approach in the moments before sleep, a city that exists only in the space between waking thought and the deep quiet that follows. The ocean does not rush us. It moves in its own time, and tonight we move with it. There is no urgency here, no countdown, no climax waiting at the end of the voyage. There's only the water, and the rhythm of the water, and the feeling that somewhere beneath the surface something rests, not hidden, not lost, simply resting, and we are invited to rest with it. This is a voyage, not a search, not an investigation. A voyage in the oldest sense of the word, a movement across distance not to arrive, but to be changed by the act of moving. To let the passage of time and water smooth the edges of waking thought, until all that remains is the feeling of motion itself. The ocean keeps its secrets, but it does not keep them cruelly. It simply holds them in a place where urgency cannot reach, where questions lose their sharpness, where the need to know becomes slowly, gently, the willingness to simply be present with not knowing. And so we set out, not toward answers, not toward proof, but toward the memory of something that may never have existed except in the way all things exist, when we close our eyes and let the water carry us. Atlantis waits, not in any particular direction, not at any particular depth. It waits in the same place sleep waits, just beyond the edge of effort, just past the point where we stop trying to hold on. The ocean hums, the night deepens, and we begin to drift. The story arrives like most old stories do, not from a single voice, but through many, passed from one mouth to another, carried across years and languages, translated and mistranslated, remembered and half forgotten, until what remains is not the fact of the thing, but the shape of it, the feeling it leaves behind. Somewhere in Athens, 24 centuries ago, a man named Plato sat with his students and told them a story. Not a myth, he insisted, not a fable meant to teach. A memory, something passed down through his family, something his ancestor Solon had heard during his travels in Egypt, from priests who kept records older than Greece itself. Priests who spoke of a time before time had been carefully counted, a time when the world was arranged differently, and the sea held more than it does now. They spoke of an island, beyond the pillars, beyond the edge of the known world, beyond the place where Greek ships turned back, because the ocean became strange, and the stars overhead no longer guided the way home. An island so far from the center of things that it existed almost as rumor, almost as hope. A place where the land had been shaped not by chance, but by intention, where water and stone had been arranged into something that resembled order, where abundance was not fought for, but simply present, like air. Plato listened to this inherited memory, and he wrote it down, not as history, not quite, but as something that lived in the space between history and longing. He called the place Atlantis, and in calling it, he gave it a kind of life that even time could not fully erase. But what did he actually say? He said the island was large, larger than Libya and Asia combined, though these measurements mean little now. He said it was organized into rings, circles of land and water alternating like breath, like rhythm, like something designed to mirror the cosmos itself. At the center, a hill. On the hill, a temple. Around the temple, a city. Around the city, water. And around the water, more land stretching outward until it met the sea. He said the people there lived in a way that required little effort. Not because they were lazy, but because the island gave freely. The soil was rich. The water was clean and abundant, flowing from 2 springs, one warm, one cold, that fed the rings and the fields beyond. There were forests thick with timber. There were mines that offered gold and copper, and a strange red metal that gleamed in the light and has no name we recognize now. The island provided, and the people organized what the island provided. They built channels to guide the water. They built walls to protect the inner rings. They built ships to carry their abundance across the ocean, and they built roads to carry it inland. Everything they needed was there, and so they built not out of lack, but out of care. Plato said they lived this way for generations. They worshipped the god Poseidon, who had claimed the island as his own, and fathered children with a mortal woman named Clito. These children became kings, and the kings divided the island among themselves, and each ruled his portion with fairness and restraint. They met in the temple at the center. They made decisions together. They wrote their laws on a pillar of orichalcum, that strange red metal, and they read those laws aloud before making judgment. They lived in balance. Not perfect balance, not the kind of balance that requires constant attention and adjustment, but the kind of balance that emerges when a system has been running long enough that it no longer feels like a system. It simply feels like life, and for a long time, that was enough. But here is where the story shifts. Here is where Plato's voice changes, even across the centuries, even through translation, even through the distance between his world and ours. Because he does not describe Atlantis as a paradise. He describes it as a place that was something, and then became something else. He says the people began to change, not overnight, not suddenly, but slowly, across generations, the way all change happens, when no one is paying close attention. The abundance that had once inspired gratitude began to inspire expectation. The strength that had once been used to protect began to be used to expand. The island reached outward not because it needed more, but because it could. Atlantis began to look beyond its own waters. It built fleets. It sent armies. It claimed lands across the sea, lands in Europe, lands in Africa, lands that had belonged to others, and now belonged to Atlantis, because Atlantis had decided it. The balance that had sustained the island for so long became, slowly, invisibly, something heavier, something that leaned too far in one direction, and the gods noticed. Not with anger, Plato says. Not with vengeance, but with something closer to sorrow, because balance, once broken, cannot be rebuilt from the outside. It can only collapse, and so it did. Plato does not linger on the details of the fall. He does not describe fire or flood or catastrophe in the way later storytellers would. He simply says that in the space of a single day-night, Atlantis was gone. The island, the rings, the temple, the people, all of it swallowed by the sea. And the ocean, which had always surrounded Atlantis, now covered it, and the world forgot, not entirely, not completely, but enough that what remained was no longer a place. It was a story, a memory that lived in the space between what was and what might have been, a warning disguised as a loss, a question disguised as an answer. Plato told this story to his students, and they listened. And then they told others, and those others told others, and the story moved forward through time, the way water moves forward through stone, slowly, patiently, reshaping what it touched. But here is the thing about stories like this. They do not survive because they are true. They survive because they are needed. Because something in us recognizes the shape of Atlantis, even if we have never seen it. Something in us knows the rhythm of abundance turning into excess, of confidence turning into pride, of balance tipping so slowly that we do not notice until the tipping is already done. Atlantis is not a place we lost. It is a place we remember losing. And in that memory, there is something we cannot let go of, not because we want to find it again, but because the act of remembering it keeps something alive in us, some awareness, some caution, some understanding that even the most ordered life, even the most abundant city, even the most balanced system is not permanent. Nothing is permanent, not even the things we build to last. And so Atlantis sank, not because it was evil, not because it was doomed, but because it was full of itself, full of its own success, full to the point where there was no room left for the kind of humility that allows a thing to continue. The ocean rose, or the island fell, or perhaps they met each other halfway, and what had been solid became water, and what had been memory became the only thing left. The story does not tell us what to feel about this. It does not ask us to mourn. It does not ask us to judge. It simply presents the loss and then moves on, the way all old stories move on, the way water moves on after swallowing land. And we are left with the image, an island, rings of water and stone, a temple at the center, a city that provided everything, and then, in the space of a night, nothing, just the ocean. Just the hum of water moving over something that no longer rises to meet the surface. Plato's voice fades, the students disperse, and the story begins its long journey forward, carried by voices we will never know, translated into languages that did not exist when it was first told. until it reaches us here, tonight, on the edge of sleep, on the edge of water, drifting towards something that may never have been real, except in the way all necessary things are real. The ocean remembers, even if we do not. And so we continue, not toward proof, not toward certainty, but toward the feeling of what was lost, and what that loss might mean, and what it feels like to float above a place that rests too deep to see. The water is calm tonight. The story has been told. And we are ready to drift deeper. Close your eyes for a moment, not to imagine, but to remember something you have never seen. A city at the edge of the world, not built in haste, not built in response to threat or necessity, built slowly, over generations, with the kind of attention that only comes when there is time, when there is abundance, when the question is not how do we survive, but how do we live well. Atlantis rises in the mind the way islands rise from the sea, gradually, inevitably, as though it had always been waiting just beneath the surface of thought. The first thing you notice is the water, not the ocean beyond, but the water within. The rings that circle the center like ripples frozen in stone and liquid, channels carved into the earth, wide enough for ships to pass, deep enough to carry the weight of commerce and ceremony. Water that does not simply surround the city but moves through it, organizing it, giving it rhythm. 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land between them. And at the center, a hill that rises just high enough to be seen from anywhere in the city, just high enough to anchor the eye. On the hill, a temple, white stone catching the light, walls covered in silver and gold, and that strange red metal, orichalcum, glowing like embers in the afternoon sun. The people did not call it beautiful. They simply lived inside it. They woke in the morning to the sound of water moving through channels. They walked along pathways lined with stone that had been placed so carefully it required no mortar. The edges met perfectly. The surfaces aligned, not because perfection was demanded, but because time had been given, because the work had been done by hands that understood the work would outlast them. The outer ring held the fields, crops that grew without strain, orchards heavy with fruit, pastures where animals grazed in the long grass, unbothered by fences because there was nowhere they needed to be kept from. The land gave, and the people accepted what was given, and the balance between the two required so little effort it became invisible. The middle ring held the workshops. Smiths who shaped metal pulled from the island's own mountains, weavers who worked cloth, dyed in colors that came from plants no one had to cultivate because they simply grew, potters, carpenters, shipbuilders, each working not in competition, but in contribution. The rhythm of hammers on anvils, the scrape of wood being planed smooth, the slow turn of the potter's wheel. Everything made to last, not because lasting was the goal, but because there was no reason to build something that would not. The innermost ring held the homes, not grand, not ornate, but solid. Stone walls thick enough to hold the coolness of morning through the heat of the day, roofs tiled in red clay that darkened when the rain came, gardens between the houses where herbs grew, and children played, and neighbors spoke to each other, across low walls, in the language of people who have known each other long enough that words are optional. At the center of it all, the temple, larger than any other structure, taller, but not imposing. It did not loom over the city. It simply held the center the way a heart holds the center of a body. The people came there to make offerings, to speak the old words, to remind themselves that the island was a gift, not a possession. That abundance was a trust, not a right. Inside, the walls were covered in gold, not as display, not as wealth, but as reflection. The light that entered through high windows caught the metal and scattered, turning the interior into something that felt less like a building and more like being inside the sun itself, warm, radiant. A place where the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary softened until it was barely there at all. The people gathered there in the evenings, not every evening, but often enough that it felt like rhythm rather than ritual. They stood in the wide hall and listened to the priests read from the pillar the laws inscribed in orichalcum that had been written by the first kings and had not needed to be rewritten because nothing had changed enough to require it. The laws were simple. Do not take more than you need. Do not harm what provides. Do not mistake abundance for permanence. Share what is given. Protect what is shared. Remember that the island is older than you and will outlast you, and that your role is not to own it, but to tend it. The people listened, and then they returned to their homes, and the next day they did the same things they had done the day before. They worked, they ate, they spoke with neighbors. They raised children who would do the same. There was a kind of perfection to it, not the perfection of flawlessness, but the perfection of fit. The city fit the island. The people fit the city. The rhythm of daily life fit the rhythm of the seasons, the tides, the slow turn of years. Nothing needed to be fixed. There were no crises, no emergencies, no moments when everything stopped because something had broken. The channels carried water. The fields produced food. The workshops produced what was needed. The government met and made decisions, but the decisions were small, adjustments, refinements. There was nothing urgent to decide, because urgency had been designed out of the system. And so the city continued, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The children born in Atlantis grew up knowing only this, knowing only abundance, knowing only the feeling of a city that required almost nothing of them except that they continue what had already been started. They learned the trades of their parents. They married. They had children of their own. They grew old watching the same harbor, the same temple, the same rings of water reflecting the same sky. And it was enough. For a long time, it was enough. But there is something that happens in a place like this, something so quiet you do not notice it until it has already happened. When everything works, you stop noticing that it works. When there is no struggle, struggle becomes invisible. When there is no lack, lack becomes unimaginable. When the city provides everything, the idea that the city could stop providing becomes something that exists only in old stories, in warnings read from pillars, in words spoken by priests who seem increasingly to be speaking about a world that no longer applies. The people of Atlantis did not grow careless. Not exactly. They simply grew comfortable. Comfort is not the same as carelessness. Comfort is quieter. Comfort does not announce itself. It settles in slowly like dust until it covers everything and you forget what things looked like before it arrived. The people still worked. They still followed the laws. They still gathered in the temple. But the reasons for doing these things began to shift. They worked not because the work mattered, but because work was what you did. They followed the laws not because the laws preserved something, but because following laws was easier than questioning them. They gathered in the temple not to remember, but because gathering was tradition. The city still functioned. But the attention that had built it, the care, the intention, The awareness that all of this was a gift began to fade, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to and say, "There, that is where it changed," but slowly, imperceptibly, the way light fades at the end of the day. You do not see it happening. You only notice, eventually, that it has become dark, and in that slow fading, something else began to grow. Not ambition, exactly, not greed, but a kind of quiet confidence that mistook comfort for permanence, feeling that because things had always been this way, they would always continue to be this way. That the city was not something that required attention, but something that simply was, like the ocean, like the sky, eternal, unchanging, safe. And so the people of Atlantis stopped looking at the pillars. They stopped listening to the priests with the same attention. They stopped asking whether the abundance they enjoyed was something they had earned, or something they had been given, or something they were meant to steward. They simply lived. And the city, which had been designed to last, continued, for now. There is a stillness that comes before change, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of held breath, of tension so evenly distributed it feels like calm, of a system running so smoothly that no one remembers it is a system at all. Atlantis, in its final years, was still beautiful. The temples still gleamed, the channels still carried water, the fields still produced more than enough. The ships still sailed out past the rings and returned laden with goods from distant lands, lands that traded with Atlantis, not because they had to, but because Atlantis had become the center of things. The place everything flowed toward. Nothing had broken, nothing had failed, but something had shifted. If you had walked the streets of Atlantis in those years, you would not have seen decay. You would have seen prosperity, abundance, a city at the height of its power. People moved through their days with the ease of those who have never known hardship. Children played in the gardens. Merchants called out their wares in the markets. Ships arrived and departed with the rhythm of tides. But if you had stood very still and listened very carefully, you might have noticed something beneath the surface, a quietness that was not quite peace. The people still gathered in the temple, but the gatherings felt different now, not smaller, not less frequent, but lighter, as though the weight of what was being said had diminished, as though the words were still spoken, but the meaning had evaporated, leaving only sound. The priest still read from the pillar, "Do not take more than you need. Do not harm what provides. Remember that the island is older than you." But the people who listened did so with the kind of attention you give to something familiar, something you have heard so many times it no longer requires thought. They nodded, they murmured agreement, and then they left, and the words dissolved in the air behind them. Because it was easy to agree with warnings when nothing bad had ever happened. It was easy to promise restraint when restraint had never been tested. The kings still met at the center. They still made their decisions together, still consulted the old laws, still spoke with the gravity of those entrusted with something larger than themselves. But the decisions they made were no longer about preservation. They were about expansion, not conquest, not yet, but a slow, steady reaching outward. The island had provided so much for so long that it seemed only natural to share that abundance, to extend it, to bring other lands into the network of trade and influence that Atlantis had built. The ships that sailed from the harbor carried not just goods, but expectations. Atlantis had become the standard by which other places measured themselves, the city that proved what was possible when order and abundance aligned. And the people of Atlantis, who had once built their city out of gratitude, began to see themselves as the ones who had created the abundance, who had earned it, who deserved it. Pride is a quiet thing. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself. It simply settles in, like the comfort before it, until it becomes the lens through which everything is seen. The people of Atlantis were not cruel. They were not greedy. They were not tyrants. They were simply confident that what they had built would last. Confident that the systems they had inherited would continue. Confident that the balance they enjoyed was not a gift to be maintained, but a state to be assumed. And in that confidence, they stopped watching. They stopped paying attention to the small signs. The way the channels required more maintenance now. The way the fields, though still abundant, produced slightly less each year. The way the ships returned from distant lands carrying not just goods, but whispers, rumors of resentment, of resistance, of places that had grown tired of Atlantis standing at the center of things. But these were small things, barely noticeable, certainly not urgent, and so they were noted, and then forgotten, and life continued as it always had. In the evenings, families gathered in their homes. They ate together. They spoke of the day's work. They made plans for tomorrow, and next week, and next year. Plans that assumed the world would remain as it was, that the abundance would continue, that the city would stand. Because why would not it? Atlantis had always stood. For as long as anyone could remember, the city had been there, solid, permanent, the kind of permanence that makes it impossible to imagine anything else. And so the people slept soundly in their beds. They woke to the same sunrise, the same routines, the same certainty that today would be like yesterday, and tomorrow would be like today. The water in the channels moved as it always had. The ships came and went. The temple doors opened each morning and closed each evening. Nothing had changed, but everything was about to. There is a moment, impossible to identify except in hindsight, when a system tips from balance into imbalance, when the small accumulated shifts, each one invisible on its own, reach a threshold, when what has been stable becomes precarious. Atlantis had reached that moment, but no one knew. The priests read their warnings, but the warnings had become ritual. The kings made their plans, but the plans assumed continuation. The people lived their lives, but their lives had become patterns rather than choices. The island still provided. The city still functioned, but beneath the surface, beneath the stone and water and carefully organized order, something had changed. Not visibly, not measurably, but irrevocably. The stillness that had felt like peace was now the stillness of something held too tightly, of breath drawn in and not yet released, of tension waiting for release. And on one particular evening, as the sun set over the outer ring and the temple caught the last of the light, the people of Atlantis went about their lives as they always had. They had no reason to think this evening was different from any other, no reason to look up at the sky and wonder, no reason to feel anything except the comfortable certainty that tomorrow would come, and the city would still be there, and everything would continue as it always had. The night arrived slowly, gently, the way night always arrived in Atlantis. The lights in the homes flickered on. The harbor grew quiet. The streets emptied. The city settled into sleep with the ease of something that has never known fear, and the ocean, which had surrounded the island for as long as the island had existed, moved in its own rhythm. Patient, inevitable, waiting for nothing, simply continuing, as it always had, as it always would. The night came as nights always came. Quietly, without announcement. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the sky deepened from blue to violet to black, and the stars appeared one by one in their familiar positions. The people of Atlantis closed their doors. They lit their lamps. They spoke in low voices about small things. What needed doing tomorrow? What had been done today? The ordinary concerns of ordinary evenings. No one noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a different quality to the silence, a thickness, as though the air itself had grown heavier, as though the island were holding its breath. But there was nothing to notice, really. The water in the channels moved as it always moved. The temples stood as it always stood. The ships rocked gently in the harbor, their masts swaying with the rhythm of small waves. Everything was as it should be. The children were put to bed, the lamps were extinguished, and the city fell into sleep, the way it had fallen into sleep 1,000 times before. Somewhere deep beneath the island, something shifted, not violently, not suddenly, but with the slow, inexorable movement of things that have been under pressure for longer than anyone can measure. The earth, which had held the island steady for generations, found a new position, a settling, a release of tension that had been building in darkness, in silence, in the spaces between stone, where no one could see. The island moved, just slightly, just enough. On the surface, in the sleeping city, a few people woke, not with alarm, but with the vague awareness of something changed, a feeling, a sensation like the one you get when you wake in the night and cannot remember why. They lay in their beds, listening, waiting for the feeling to resolve itself into meaning. But there was only silence, and so they closed their eyes again. The earth continued its slow adjustment. In the temple, a crack appeared in one of the great pillars, hairline thin, invisible in the darkness, the kind of crack that, in daylight, might have been noticed, might have been examined, might have prompted concern. But there was no daylight. There was only the long, patient dark, and the crack widened without sound, without witness. The water in the channels began to move differently, not faster, not slower, but with a new pattern, a current that had not been there before. It flowed in directions it had not flowed, finding paths through the carefully designed rings that had not existed, until the stone beneath them changed position. Still, no one woke. Or those who woke did not understand what they were waking to, because there was no crash, no roar, no dramatic announcement of catastrophe. There was only the slow, almost gentle reorganization of earth and water, the kind of change that happens beneath the threshold of human awareness, the kind of change that is only understood after it has finished happening. The outer ring began to sink, not collapse, not crumble, simply sink, the way a stone sinks when you release it into water. Slowly, evenly, the fields where crops had grown for generations lowered themselves toward the ocean. The soil remained intact, the plants remained rooted. But the ground beneath them was descending, inch by inch, into a place where ground was not meant to be. The ocean, which had always surrounded the island, began to move inward, not in waves, not in flood, but in a slow, patient advance. The water rose to meet the sinking land, and where they met, they merged. The boundary between island and ocean, a boundary that had seemed so clear, so permanent, began to blur. In the middle ring, the workshops stood silent, the anvils cold, the wheels still, the tools laid down at the end of the day, waiting for morning. But morning was not coming in the way anyone expected. The stone beneath the workshops was shifting, tilting at angles so slight they could not be felt. but which would make the doors impossible to open when the sun rose, which would make the floors uneven, which would make the whole structure something other than what it had been. The homes in the inner ring remained intact, for now. The people inside them slept through the slow transformation. They dreamed ordinary dreams. Dreams of tomorrow's work, of conversations not yet finished, of plans that assumed the world would remain the world. But outside, the water continued its advance. It moved through the channels, but the channels could no longer contain it. The carefully carved pathways, designed to guide water in precise directions, found themselves insufficient. The water flowed over the edges. It spread across the stone pathways. It touched the foundations of homes and did not stop. Still gentle, still patient, but inevitable. At the center of the island, the temple remained. The crack in the pillar had widened, but the pillar still stood. The wall still held. The gold on the surfaces still caught what little light existed. Moonlight, starlight, the faint glow that water sometimes holds in darkness. But the hill beneath the temple was sinking too. Slower than the outer rings, more resistant, but subject to the same forces, the same slow surrender to something larger and older and more patient than anything human hands had built. By the time the first gray light appeared on the horizon, Atlantis had changed. Not disappeared, not destroyed, but fundamentally altered in ways that could not be undone. The people woke slowly. Some noticed immediately. The water in their homes, the tilt of floors, the doors that would not open. Others noticed only gradually, stepping outside to find streets that were no longer streets but channels, gardens that were no longer gardens but pools. There was no panic, not at first. Because catastrophe, when it happens slowly, does not feel like catastrophe. It feels like a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed. The people moved through their homes, gathering what they could. They helped neighbors. They called to each other across the rising water. They did not yet understand that this was not a problem to be solved. By mid-morning, the outer ring was gone, not destroyed, simply submerged. The fields, the orchards, the pastures, all of it resting now beneath a calm surface of water that reflected the sky, as though nothing had changed, as though the land beneath had never existed. The middle ring followed, the workshops, storehouses, the places where the work of the city had been done, all of it yielding to the patient advance of the ocean. The ships in the harbor, which had been tied to docks, now floated freely, unmoored, drifting in water that had no boundary. The people gathered on the inner ring, those who could reach it, those who had understood quickly enough. They stood together, watching the water rise, watching their city transform from solid ground into memory. Some wept, some stood in silence. Some still did not believe what they were seeing, because how could this be happening? How could a city that had stood for generations simply sink? How could the abundance, the order, the careful design of everything they had known simply yield to water? But it was happening, and by afternoon, even the inner ring was compromised. The homes where families had lived, where children had been born, where countless ordinary evenings had unfolded, all of it now surrounded by water that continued to rise, not rapidly, but without pause, without mercy, without any acknowledgement of what it was covering. The temple stood longest. At the center of the island, on the hill that had been highest, the temple remained visible, even as everything around it disappeared. The gold walls caught the afternoon light. The great doors stood open, as they always stood, as though waiting for a gathering that would never come. And the people who remained standing on rooftops, clinging to the last pieces of solid ground, watched the temple, not with hope of rescue, not with expectation of miracle, but with the kind of attention you give to something you are watching. Leave, something you are saying goodbye to, without words. The water reached the base of the temple as the sun began to set. It moved up the steps, slowly, one step at a time, as though giving those watching time to remember, time to understand, time to accept. And then the water reached the doors, and then it moved inside. And the light that had always filled that space, the reflected gold, the warmth, the feeling of something sacred, began to dim as the water rose, and the light had nowhere left to reflect. By nightfall, the temple was gone, not destroyed, not broken, simply absorbed. The ocean, which had always surrounded Atlantis, now covered it. The rings were gone, the channels were gone. The hill at the center was gone. Everything that had been carefully built, carefully maintained, carefully assumed to be permanent, all of it resting now beneath a surface that moved with the same rhythm it had always moved with, as though nothing had happened, as though the island had never begun. The people who had escaped, those who had reached ships in time, those who had been visiting other lands, those who had simply been lucky, would carry the memory forward. They would tell the story. They would pass it to their children, and their children would pass it to theirs, and the story would change in the telling, would grow in some places and shrink in others, until what remained was not the fact of Atlantis, but the feeling of it, the feeling of loss, the feeling of something that had seemed permanent, revealed to be temporary, the feeling of watching something disappear, not with violence, but with patience. And on the ocean's surface, where Atlantis had been, there was only water, calm, dark, reflecting the stars that had watched the island for generations and would watch the empty water for generations more. Not all endings arrive loudly. Some arrive like this, quietly, in the space of a night, leaving behind only the question of what, if anything, remains when the visible world sinks and only memory is left to mark where it once stood. The ocean moved, the night deepened, and Atlantis became a place you could no longer sail to, only a place you could remember, only a place you could drift toward in the moments before sleep. The sea does not mourn. It does not mark the places where land used to be. It does not carry monuments or markers. It does not remember in the way humans remember, with words, with stories, with the deliberate act of holding something in mind, so it does not disappear. The sea simply continues. It moves over what was, and in moving it becomes what is. The waves that roll across the surface where Atlantis stood are the same waves that roll across every surface. The currents that flow through the depths are the same currents that have always flowed. The water does not know it covers something. It only knows its own motion. And beneath that motion, in the darkness where light does not reach, Atlantis rests, not destroyed, not broken into pieces, but softened, transformed. The stone that had been carved and placed with such care, now wrapped in silence. The channels that had guided water, now filled with water, indistinguishable from the ocean around them. The temple at the center, the gold walls, the great doors, all of it holding a different kind of light now, the kind that comes from depth, the kind that comes from being covered. Nothing moves there. No fish disturb the streets. No current rearranges the stones. There is only the pressure of water, and the slow, patient work of time, and the sense that something is there without being visible. Present without being present. The people who had lived there are gone. Those who survived carried the memory to other shores. They told what they had seen. They described the rings, the temple, the abundance, the slow sinking. They spoke with the urgency of those who have witnessed something that should not have been possible. They wanted others to understand, to believe, to recognize what had been lost. But the others had not seen it. The others had only stories. And stories, no matter how urgently told, become softer over time. They lose their edges. They blend with other stories. The details that seem so important, the exact width of the channels, the precise color of the orichalcum, the number of ships in the harbor, begin to shift, to change, to become approximate. And Atlantis, which had been a place, became a memory, and a memory, over time, became a feeling. The ocean does not care about this transformation. It continues its work without regard for what rests beneath. The tides pull in and pull out. The waves rise and fall. The water is warm in some seasons and cold in others, and the change happens without effort, without intention. The ocean is not cruel. It is not kind. It simply is. And in being, it covers everything equally, the places where cities stood, and the places where nothing ever stood, the places where people lived, and the places where only water has ever been. All of it held beneath the same surface, all of it subject to the same motion. Time moves differently here, not slower, exactly, not faster, but with a different quality. Above the water, time is marked by days and seasons and years, by the rise and fall of civilizations, by the birth and death of a people who measure their lives in moments, in memories, in the accumulation of experience. But beneath the water, time is something else. It is the slow drift of sediment, the gradual erosion of stone, the patient work of pressure and current. It is change so slow that it cannot be witnessed, only inferred, only understood after centuries have passed, and what was sharp has become smooth, and what was defined has become vague. Atlantis is changing, not visibly, not in any way that could be observed from one day to the next. But over years, over decades, over the long stretch of time that humans cannot fully conceive of, the city is becoming something other than what it was. The gold on the temple walls is still there, but it no longer gleams. The stone of the buildings is still there, but the edges where one stone met another are softening. The channels are still there, but they no longer guide anything. They are simply grooves in stone, filling and emptying with the same water that fills and empties everything. The ocean is reclaiming what was given, not with violence, not with intention, but with the simple fact of its presence. With the weight of water and the passage of time and the slow, inevitable return of all things to their simplest forms. And on the surface, where ships once sailed with purpose and destination, there is nothing to mark the place. No island, no ruins breaking through the waves, no disturbance in the pattern of water that would make you think something different exists here. The ocean looks the same as it looks everywhere, blue under sunlight, gray under clouds, black under night, moving in the way water moves, without beginning, without end. A ship could pass over Atlantis and never know, and many ships have. Over the centuries since the sinking, countless vessels have crossed these waters. Some were seeking the island, following old stories, chasing rumors. Others were simply traveling, moving from one known place to another, with no thought of what might rest beneath their hulls. They all passed over the same water, and the water gave them nothing. No sign, no proof, no confirmation that what they sought or what they ignored was actually there. Because the ocean keeps what it covers, not jealously, not possessively, but completely. What sinks into the ocean becomes part of the ocean. It exists in a realm where human searching cannot reach, where human certainty cannot penetrate, where the question of whether something is there or not there becomes meaningless, because there is a concept that requires surfaces, and surfaces are what the ocean has replaced. And so Atlantis rests in darkness, in silence, in a place where the distinction between existing and not existing has blurred until it barely matters. The people who remember it are fewer now. Not gone entirely, but fewer. The stories have been passed down, but with each generation, something is lost. A detail, a feeling, the urgency that the first survivors carried, the need to make others understand, has faded into something gentler, something more like wonder than warning. And the ocean continues. It moves over Atlantis, the way it moves over everything, without preference, without memory, without any acknowledgement that what it covers was once illuminated by sun, once walked by people, once filled with voices and work and the ordinary friction of life. Waves continue their rhythm, rising and falling, the same rhythm they have followed since before Atlantis existed. The same rhythm they will follow long after the last person who remembers Atlantis has forgotten. There is no sadness in this, no tragedy, only the patient truth of water and time. Only the understanding that what is built will be unmade, and what is unmade will rest, and what rests will eventually become indistinguishable from the space it occupies. Atlantis is still there, beneath the surface, in the dark, but it is not waiting. It is not hoping to be found. It is simply resting, the way all things rest when motion has stopped and the effort of maintaining form has been released. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any place can hope for. To exist fully in its time, and then to rest gently when that time has passed. The ocean does not need to remember. It does not need to mark or honor or preserve. It simply holds. And in holding, it allows what was to dissolve into what is. The surface is calm tonight. The stars reflect in the water the way they always have. And somewhere far below, where no light reaches, where no sound penetrates, Atlantis continues its slow transformation from city into ocean, from memory into forgetting, from something that was into something that simply is. The water moves, the night deepens, and we drift here, above it all, carried by the same current that carries everything, not searching. Not seeking, simply floating in the space between what was known and what can never be known again. The ocean breeze, in, out, and in that rhythm there is room for rest, room to let go of the need to understand, room to simply be here on the surface, moving gently, while beneath us, in darkness we cannot penetrate, something that was once solid continues its patient dissolution into water, into time, into the long quiet after. There is something in us that cannot leave loss alone, even when the loss is complete, even when the thing lost is beyond recovery, Even when searching serves no practical purpose, we search anyway. Not because we expect to find what we are looking for, but because the act of looking is itself a kind of answer to the question loss poses. After Atlantis sank, after the survivors carried their stories to distant shores, after the immediate shock of disappearance faded into the longer ache of absence, people began to wonder. Not all people, not immediately, but slowly, over years and then centuries, the question formed itself in minds that had never seen the island, but had heard it described, had felt the shape of it in stories, had sensed that something was missing from the world. Even if they could not say exactly what, where did it go? Could it still be there? Could something that had been so real, so solid, so abundant, simply vanish without leaving a trace? The ocean, of course, offered no answers. It moved as it always moved. It reflected sky and sun and stars. It carried ships from one known shore to another, and if those ships passed over the place where Atlantis had been, the water beneath them gave no indication. No difference in depth, no disturbance in current, nothing to suggest that what rested below was anything other than ocean floor, stone and sand and the accumulated sediment of ages. But the people looking did not know this, could not know this, and so they looked. The first searchers were those who had known people who had known Atlantis, second-generation grief. The children of survivors or the students of survivors, or those who had heard the stories told with enough detail and enough sorrow that the island became real to them, even though they had never seen it. They prepared ships, not great fleets, not expeditions funded by empires, just small vessels crewed by those who believed, or who wanted to believe, or who simply needed to do something with the restlessness that the stories had created in them. They sailed west, beyond the familiar coastlines, beyond the islands everyone knew, into waters that were marked on maps only as blankness, the spaces between known places where cartographers wrote warnings or drew monsters, or simply left the parchment empty because no one had returned to say what was there. The ships sailed for days, for weeks. The crews watched the horizon with the kind of attention that comes from wanting to see something so badly that every wave, every distant cloud, every change in the color of water becomes a possible sign. But the horizon remained empty. The ocean revealed nothing. And after enough time passed, after supplies ran low, after the wind turned against them, after the initial conviction faded into the longer reality of open water that looked the same in every direction, the ships turned back. They returned to shore with nothing to show for their journey except the knowledge that the ocean was larger and emptier than they had imagined. That whatever Atlantis had been, it was not somewhere that could be reached by simply sailing in the direction of longing. But this did not stop the searching. It never does. Over the centuries, the search for Atlantis became something different. With each generation, the methods changed, the motivations shifted, but the essential impulse remained the same, the need to locate what had been lost, to make absence into presence, to prove that the stories were not just stories. Explorers came with newer ships, better navigation, maps that claimed more accuracy than the maps before. They sailed to the edges of the known world, and then past those edges. They catalogued coastlines and islands. They measured depths and currents. They drew careful charts showing where they had been and what they had found. And what they found were islands, many islands, some large, some small, scattered across the ocean like fragments of something larger. And each time an island was discovered, there were those who wondered, could this be it? Could this be what remains of Atlantis? Could the stories of a single great island actually be memories of an archipelago scattered by the same catastrophe that sank the center? The islands were examined, measured, explored, colonies established on some of them, but none of them held ruins that matched the descriptions. None of them showed evidence of rings or channels or temples covered in gold. They were simply islands, formed by the same volcanic and ectonic processes that form all islands, holding nothing more mysterious than stone and soil and the plants and animals that had found their way there. And so the searching continued. By the time ships could cross oceans with reliability, by the time maps showed most of the world's coastlines with reasonable accuracy, the search for Atlantis had become something else. No longer a matter of sailing and hoping, but a matter of theory, of matching descriptions to geography, of trying to find, among all the places that were known, one that could have been Atlantis. Perhaps it was in the Mediterranean, some said. Perhaps the stories described not an island in the Atlantic, but something closer, an island that had been destroyed by volcanic eruption or earthquake. There were places that matched, islands that had exploded, civilizations that had disappeared with enough drama that the memory could have been transformed over centuries into the story Plato told. Perhaps it was in the Caribbean, others suggested, or off the coast of Africa, or near Antarctica, or in the North Sea. Each theory came with its evidence: geological formations that resembled rings, underwater structures that might have been walls, measurements that seemed to align with the dimensions given in ancient texts. But none of the theories could be proven, because the ocean, even as humans learned to map it, even as technology allowed them to see beneath its surface, remained vast, remained deep, remained full of shapes and shadows that could be interpreted as anything. Sonar revealed ridges and trenches. Submarine expeditions found underwater mountains and valleys. Divers discovered ruins of cities that had sunk, not Atlantis, but other places, other civilizations that had built too close to shorelines or on unstable ground and had been claimed by water. And each discovery prompted the same response. Could this be it? Could this finally be proof? But the ruins were always too small, or too recent, or too clearly connected to known civilizations. They were tragic, yes. They were evidence that the ocean had swallowed many things over many ages, but they were not Atlantis. And slowly, gradually, as more of the ocean was explored and mapped, as the blank spaces on charts filled in with bathymetric data and seafloor contours, the possibility of finding Atlantis began to seem less like a matter of looking harder and more like a matter of understanding differently. Perhaps Atlantis was not a place that could be found. Perhaps the searching was itself the point, not the destination, but the journey, not the discovery, but the act of looking. The willingness to believe that somewhere, beneath water or beneath time, something extraordinary had existed and might still exist in a form we could recognize, if only we knew where to look. The ocean continued its work, indifferent to the searching. It kept what it kept. It revealed nothing unless forced. And even when forced, when submarines descended into trenches, when sonar mapped the contours of the deep, it gave only shapes, only suggestions, only data that could be interpreted, but never confirmed. And the people who searched began to understand something, that the ocean was not hiding Atlantis. It was simply being the ocean, vast, deep, full of things that once were and are no longer, full of stone and sediment, and the slow accumulation of everything that has ever sunk or been buried or dissolved into water. Atlantis was there, perhaps, or it was not. Or it had been there and was no longer recognizable as anything other than ocean floor. The searching had not failed. It had simply encountered the limits of what searching can accomplish. The point where evidence becomes interpretation, where proof becomes belief, where the desire to find something confronts the reality that some things, once lost, remain lost not because they are hidden, but because loss is their final and complete state. And maybe that was the real discovery, not Atlantis itself, but the understanding that came from looking for it. The understanding that humans need to search for lost things even when the searching is futile, that we need to believe in places like Atlantis even when we cannot find them, that the story serves a purpose that has nothing to do with whether the story is true. The ocean holds its secrets, not jealously, but completely. And we continue to drift above them, looking down into water that shows us only our own reflection, asking questions that have no answers, except the ones we create by asking. Maybe Atlantis sinks every time we look for it. Maybe the act of searching pushes it deeper, transforms it further, ensures that what we find is never quite what we were looking for. Or maybe it simply rests, unmoved by our searching, unchanged by our theories, present in the way things are present, when they exist only as memory, only as possibility, only as the feeling that somewhere beneath everything we know, something else once. The ships continue to sail, the technology continues to improve, and the ocean continues to give us nothing but water, nothing but depth, nothing but the patient suggestion that some losses are meant to remain losses, that some absences are meant to stay absent, that some stories are meant to be told and retold without ever resolving into fact. And in that endless search, in that perpetual looking without finding, there is something almost like peace. The peace of knowing you are looking for something you will never find. The peace of searching anyway. There comes a moment in every search when the urgency fades. Not because you have found what you were looking for, not because you have given up, but because the searching itself has changed you, has taught you something about the nature of looking, and you realize that the question you started with is no longer the question you are asking. The search for Atlantis reaches this moment again and again, in different eras, with different people, in different ways, but always, eventually, the fever of discovery cools into something quieter. The need to prove transforms into the willingness to wonder. The conviction that Atlantis must be found somewhere gives way to the understanding that perhaps not finding is itself a kind of answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but an answer nonetheless. There is a space between questions where this realization lives. A space where you are no longer actively searching but have not yet stopped caring. Where the story still matters but the facts have become less important than what the facts represent. Where Atlantis exists not as a location, but as an idea that the mind returns to in moments of quiet. In this space, the ocean becomes different, not a barrier to be overcome or a mystery to be solved, but simply itself, water and depth and the slow movement of currents, a place that holds things without judgment, that covers without concealing, that exists in a state so complete, so fundamental, that human categories like lost and found begin to seem irrelevant. The people who reach this space, this pause between searching and forgetting, often find themselves standing at shorelines, not because they are planning expeditions, not because they are studying maps, but because something draws them to the edge where land meets water, where the solid world they know gives way to something fluid and unknowable, where they can stand with their feet on certainty and their eyes on vastness and feel, without needing to articulate it, the truth that some things cannot be recovered. They watch the waves, walk not for out the same rhythm that has continued since before Atlantis existed, the same rhythm that will continue long after the last person who remembers the story has stopped remembering. And in watching something releases, not sadness exactly, not grief, but the particular tension that comes from wanting something that cannot be had, the tightness of holding a question that will never be answered. The ocean does not require this tension. It asks nothing of those who stand at its edge. It does not demand belief or skepticism. It does not reward searching or punish not searching. It simply moves, and in moving, it offers a kind of permission to stop, permission to rest, permission to let the question remain a question without needing to resolve it into certainty. This is not giving up. This is something different. This is the recognition that some questions exist, not to be answered, but to be held, to be carried, to be returned to occasionally, the way you return to a familiar place, not because you expect it to have changed, but because the act of returning itself has value. Atlantis, in this space, becomes gentle. The urgency drains from it. The need to prove or disprove, to locate or dismiss, falls away like tension leaving a body. What remains is the simple fact of the story, the image of rings and water, the memory of abundance, the slow sinking, the patient ocean covering what was, and maybe that is enough. Maybe the story does its work not by being confirmed, but by being contemplated, by existing as a point of reflection, by giving us something to think about when we think about balance and excess and the impermanence of even the most carefully constructed things. In the space between questions, Atlantis stops being a mystery. It becomes instead a meditation, a way of thinking about loss that does not require the loss to be recoverable, a way of honoring what is gone without needing to bring it back, a way of acknowledging that civilizations rise and fall, that abundance turns to absence, that order yields to entropy, and that this is not a tragedy requiring solution, but simply the nature of things. The people standing at the shoreline understand this, even if they do not say it. They feel it in the rhythm of waves, in the expanse of water stretching beyond sight, in the knowledge that beneath that water somewhere, or perhaps nowhere, Atlantis rests, and that its resting is not a problem, not a puzzle, not something that needs to be fixed or found or proven. Just a resting, just an ending that came, as all endings come, and left behind nothing but the space where something used to be. And that space is not empty. It is full of water, full of time, full of the slow, patient work of dissolution and transformation, and the gradual return of all constructed things to their elemental forms. The questions that began the search: where is Atlantis? Can we find it? Was it real? Fade here. Not because they have been answered, but because they have been outgrown, because the person asking them has changed through the process of asking, because the need that generated the questions has been met in some way that has nothing to do with answers. This is the gift of unsolved mysteries. They teach us to hold uncertainty, to sit with not knowing, to find peace in the space between question and answer, in the long pause where curiosity softens into acceptance. The ocean holds this space. It has always held it. Long before humans came to its edges with questions, long before Atlantis sank, or stories were told, or anyone wondered whether the stories were true, the ocean has existed in the state of perfect suspension, neither giving nor withholding, neither revealing nor concealing. simply being itself, and in being itself creating the conditions for everything else to exist, to change, to end, to rest. And we, standing at the edge or drifting on the surface, or descending into the depths with our technologies and theories, eventually learn to mirror this state. We stop demanding. We stop insisting. We simply float in the not knowing and find that the not knowing holds us as surely as water holds anything placed within it. The search for Atlantis does not end in this space. It simply pauses. It takes a breath. It allows the question to exist without pressure, without urgency, without the need to be anything other than what it is. A question asked across centuries by people who needed something to look for, something to wonder about, something to remind them that beneath the surface of the known world, mystery still exists. And maybe always will. The waves continue. The night deepens. And in the space between questions, where the search has paused but not stopped, where wonder exists without anxiety, we find something unexpected, not Atlantis, but rest. The same rest that Atlantis itself has found, somewhere beneath us, in darkness, in silence, in the slow embrace of water and time. And perhaps that has been the answer all along. Not where Atlantis is, but how to rest with not knowing, how to hold loss without needing to reverse it, how to carry questions without needing to resolve them. The ocean teaches this, patiently, without words. And we, drifting here in the space between searching and sleeping, begin to understand, begin to soften, begin to let go of the need to find, and simply float in the presence of what cannot be found, but somehow still remains. There are stories we tell because they are true, and there are stories we tell because we need them to be. Atlantis belongs to the second category, not because it did not exist. Perhaps it did, some form, in some place, at some time, but because the truth of Atlantis, if there ever was one, matters less than what the story does, what it has always done, what it continues to do, each time someone hears it and feels something shift inside them, a recognition, not of facts, but of pattern, of shape, of the arc that civilizations follow, and that individuals follow, and that perhaps all things follow, when they rise high enough to become visible. We tell the story of Atlantis because it tells us. It speaks to something we already know, but rarely acknowledge, something we feel, but cannot always name. The understanding that what we build, no matter how carefully, no matter how beautifully, no matter how abundantly, is not permanent. That success contains within it the conditions for its own ending. That the moment of greatest flourishing is also the moment of greatest vulnerability. This is not a comfortable truth, and so we disguise it. We wrap it in the form of a lost civilization. We place it safely in the past, in a location that cannot be confirmed, involving people we never knew. We make it a story about them, those ancient people who grew proud, who forgot restraint, who mistook abundance for invincibility, and in doing so, we create just enough distance that we can contemplate the pattern without having to fully confront it in ourselves. But the distance is an illusion. Atlantis is not about them. It has never been about them. It is about the part of us that knows we are building on unstable ground, the part that feels the slow accumulation of comfort turning into complacency, the part that watches systems running so smoothly we forget they are systems, forget they require maintenance, forget they can fail, the part that knows, even as we reach for more, that more might be a thing that tips the balance. This is why the story survives, not because it offers answers, but because it offers reflection. A mirror held up to every civilization that has ever grown large enough to see itself. Every empire that has expanded beyond its ability to maintain coherence. Every culture that has enjoyed abundance long enough to forget what scarcity feels like. Atlantis says, "This has happened before." Atlantis says, "This will happen again." Atlantis says, "Pay attention to the moment when everything is working, because that might be the moment just before everything stops." But it says these things gently. It does not lecture. It does not moralize. It simply presents the image: rings of water and stone, a temple at the center, abundance turning to pride, pride turning to reach, reach turning to overextension, and lets us find ourselves in the image if we are ready. And if we are not ready, the story simply rests. It waits. It has waited for centuries, and it will wait for centuries more, because the pattern it describes is not tied to any particular era or technology or political system. It is fundamental, built into the structure of complex things, the inevitable tendency of all high-functioning systems to optimize themselves toward fragility. We see this pattern everywhere, once we learn to look for it, in corporations that grow so efficient they cannot adapt when conditions change, in technologies that become so integrated they cannot be replaced when they fail, in societies that build such complex interdependencies that the failure of one small component cascades through the entire structure, in our own lives, even in the moments when we have everything arranged just right, every need met, every system running smoothly, and we feel beneath the satisfaction a thread of anxiety, the awareness that this arrangement is delicate, that it depends on things continuing as they are, that any disruption could reveal how much we have built on the assumption of stability. Atlantis speaks to this anxiety. It gives it form. It says, "You are right to feel this. You are right to notice the fragility beneath the abundance. You are right to wonder what happens when the balance tips." But it also says something else, something quieter, something that takes longer to hear. It says, "This is how things work," not as punishment, not as judgment, but as process, the natural cycle of building and flourishing, and reaching too far, and dissolving back into simpler forms, the pattern that governs cities and civilizations and species and stars. The understanding that nothing escapes entropy, that all complexity eventually simplifies, that every height is temporary and every depth is temporary, and the only constant is the movement between them. Atlantis sank, not because it was bad, but because it was complete, because it had reached the peak of what it could be, and peaks, by definition, are the places from which the only movement is down, not immediately, not inevitably, but eventually, always eventually. And maybe there is peace in recognizing this. Maybe the story of Atlantis persists not to make us afraid of building, but to help us build with awareness, to create with the understanding that what we create will not last forever, and that this is not a failure, but simply the nature of creation, that the goal is not permanence, but presence, not lasting but being fully alive in the time that is given. The people of Atlantis did not fail because they built the great city. They built a great city, and that was enough. That was complete. That was a full expression of what they were capable of in that time, in that place, with those resources. And when it sank, when the ocean covered it, when all that remained was story, that too was complete, because the value of what was built is not diminished by its ending. The abundance was real while it lasted. The order was genuine. The beauty existed. The people lived full lives in a place that provided for them in ways most places never do. And then it ended. And the ending does not erase what came before. This is what the story teaches, if we listen long enough. If we move past the surface, the drama of the sinking, the mystery of the location, the question of whether it was real, and drift down to the deeper meaning, we find something unexpected. Not a warning against ambition, not a call to remain small and safe, but an invitation to build beautifully, abundantly, carefully, with a full awareness that what we build is temporary. That loss is not failure, that impermanence is not tragedy, that the cycle of rising and falling is not something to be defeated, but something to be danced with. Atlantis rises in every generation, sometimes as a city, sometimes as an idea, sometimes as a moment of collective achievement, when everything aligns and abundance flows, and people look around at what they have created and feel, for a moment, that they have built something that will last. And then, because it must, it sinks. The specific forms change, the technologies differ, the names are different, but the pattern remains. We build, we flourish, we reach, we overreach, we sink. And in sinking, we make space for the next rising. This is not pessimism. This is not cynicism. This is the recognition that creation and dissolution are partners, not enemies. That you cannot have one without the other. That every ending makes room for every beginning, and every beginning carries within it the seeds of its eventual ending. The ocean knows this. It has held more Atlantises than we can count. It has covered more civilizations than history records. It has witnessed the rise and fall of countless arrangements of stone and wood and metal and intention, and it has covered them all with the same patient water, and it has moved on without nostalgia or regret. Because the ocean understands something we are still learning, that presence is what matters. That the time when something exists is the time when it is real. That afterward, when it has dissolved back into water and sediment and memory, it does not become less real. It simply becomes differently real. It becomes part of the foundation on which the next thing will build. Atlantis exists now as story, and story is not a lesser form of existence. Story is how humans carry pattern forward through time, how we preserve not the specific details, but the essential shape of things, how we pass understanding from one generation to the next, without needing to make each generation experience the loss firsthand. The story of Atlantis lets us feel the sinking without drowning. It lets us contemplate impermanence from a place of safety. It lets us hold the knowledge that what we build will not last forever, while still building, and maybe that's why it never lets go. Not because we need to find Atlantis, but because we need to be reminded, again and again, across centuries and cultures and languages, that loss is built into the structure of living. That abundance does not guarantee permanence. That even the most carefully balanced system will eventually tip. That the ocean is patient and deep, and will eventually cover everything we consider solid, not to punish us, not to prove anything, but simply because that is what oceans do. They rise, they cover, they hold, they transform what was visible into what is hidden. They turn cities into stories, and stories into feelings, and feelings into the quiet knowing that sits at the center of human awareness when we let ourselves be still enough to feel it. We are all living in Atlantis, in the moment before the sinking, in the time when everything works, in the space between abundance and loss, and the story told across millennia, whispered in 1,000 languages, carried forward by people who never saw the island, but recognized its shape in their own lives, says, this is okay. This is how it works. Build anyway, love anyway, create anyway. Knowing that what you create will not last forever does not make it less valuable. It makes it more precious, more urgent, more worthy of attention and care and the full investment of your brief time. Atlantis sank so we could learn this. Not the historical Atlantis, if it existed, but the Atlantis we carry inside us. The one we recognize when we hear the story. The one that reminds us to build beautifully while we can, and to release gracefully when we must, and to understand that both the building and the releasing are part of the same cycle, the same rhythm, the same movement of waves that rise and fall without end. The story never lets go because we need it not to. Because in a world that constantly tells us to strive for permanence, for lasting impact, for legacy that will outlive us, we need something that says, it is enough to exist fully in your time. It is enough to build knowing you will not see the completion. It is enough to flourish briefly and then dissolve back into the water from which all things come and to which all things return. Atlantis is not a place we lost. It is a truth we keep finding again and again in every ending, in every beginning, in every moment when we stand at the edge of water and feel the pull of something deep and old and true, calling us not to search, but to rest, to float, to accept, to let go of the need for permanence and find peace in the beauty of what is present now. Even knowing now will not last forever. The ocean moves, the story continues. And we, who have drifted this far, who have stayed with the telling through rings and temples and slow sinking and patient water, understand now what we have been approaching. Not a lost city, but a lost fear, the fear of impermanence, the fear of building something beautiful that will not last, the fear that if we cannot make our mark permanent, our lives will not have mattered. Atlantis sank, and the world continued, and the story of Atlantis mattered more than the stones of Atlantis ever could, because the stones were just stones, but the story is alive. It lives in us. It will live in those who come after us. It will live as long as there are people who need to be reminded that loss is not failure, that impermanence is not tragedy, that the cycle of rising and sinking is not something to fear, but something to embrace as the very mechanism of existence itself. The ocean knows, the water knows, and now, drifting here, held by the same rhythm it has held everything, we know too, not with certainty, not with proof, but with the quiet understanding that comes when you stop searching for answers and start resting in questions. When you stop trying to find Atlantis and start recognizing that you have always been living in it, in the moment before the water rises, in the moment when everything is still here, still present, still real. The ocean breathes, slowly, in the way that only water breathes, without lungs, without effort, simply rising and falling with the pull of moon and sun and in the ancient rhythms that existed before breath had a name. We have drifted far, not in distance perhaps, but in depth, through layers of story and in stone and time, through the visible world of rings and temples, into the invisible world of pattern and meaning, through the search for a place into the understanding that the place was never the point. The water holds us. It has held us the entire journey, supported without question, moved us without destination, asked nothing except that we release into its current and let it carry what we could not carry alone. And now here, in the deep part of the night, in the space where waking thought has softened into something else, we find we are not searching anymore. We are simply floating. The surface above catches starlight. small points of brightness scattered across black. The water reflects them, doubles them, creates the illusion that we are suspended between two skies, between two darknesses punctuated by the same distant lights. Beneath us, somewhere far below, Atlantis rests, or does not rest, or never existed, or exists in a way that makes the distinction meaningless. It does not matter anymore. The need to know has dissolved into the larger truth that some things are meant to be held without grasping, known without proving, remembered without recovering. The water moves us gently. There is no shore visible, no horizon, only the sense of vast space in all directions. Space that is not empty but full of water, full of dissolved minerals and salt, and the remains of everything that has ever lived in the ocean or sunk into it. Full of time itself, measured in currents and temperatures, and the slow drift of continental plates beneath the floor we cannot see. Somewhere in that fullness is Atlantis, part of the water, part of the sediment, part of the long, patient process by which all solid things return to their origins. Stone becoming sand, becoming dissolved particles, becoming part of the ocean's chemical composition, walls becoming the material from which new life will build shells, gold becoming trace elements in the bodies of creatures that have never known the word for gold. The transformation is complete, or continuing, or both. Time moves differently here. Past and present blur. The moment when Atlantis sank, and this moment now, drifting in water that might be covering it, feel separated by centuries and by nothing at all, because the ocean holds all moments simultaneously. What was is still here, in a sense, still present in the water's memory, in the stories it carries, in the way it moves over what it has covered. We float in that timelessness, neither past nor future, just this, just water, just the gentle rise and fall that mirrors breath, that becomes breath, that reminds us how to release into rhythm without thinking. In, out, rise, fall. The pattern continues whether we notice it or not, whether we are here or not. The ocean will move this way long after the last person who remembers Atlantis has stopped remembering, long after the last ship has sailed, and the last question has been asked, and the last theory has been proposed and abandoned. It will move this way when there are no more stories, when there is only water and the slow work it does, and a patient covering of everything. And in that continuation, there is something that feels like comfort, not the comfort of answers, but the comfort of pattern, of knowing that this rising and falling, this cycle of building and dissolving, this rhythm of presence and absence is not personal, not targeted, not a judgment or a punishment or even a lesson, just the way things work, the way water works, the way time works, the way everything works when you watch long enough to see the full cycle. We have been watching, not actively now, but with the kind of watching that happens when effort has ceased, when the eyes have adjusted to darkness and see not by focusing, but by allowing, when awareness spreads wide instead of narrowing to a point. And what we see or sense or feel in the watching is that Atlantis was never separate from this, never separate from the water or the cycle or the pattern. It rose from the ocean, built on an island that the ocean had made, using materials the ocean had provided, organized by people who the ocean had nourished, and when it sank, it simply returned, completing the cycle, giving back what had been borrowed. There is no tragedy in completion, only the feeling of something having run its course, having expressed itself fully. having been what it was meant to be for as long as it was meant to be, and then releasing, the way we are releasing now, thoughts loosening their hold, questions losing their urgency, the need to understand giving way to the willingness to simply be present with not understanding. The water supports this release. It asks for nothing in return. It does not require that we learn the lesson, or remember the story, or change our lives based on what we have contemplated. It simply holds us the way it holds everything, without judgment or expectation. The night has deepened into something beyond darkness, a quality of black that is not absence, but presence, the color of deep water, the color of closed eyes, the color of the space between thoughts where consciousness drifts without anchor. We drift there now, neither awake nor asleep, neither seeking nor finding, neither remembering Atlantis nor forgetting it, simply suspended in the space where the story has been told, and the silence after the story has its own weight, its own meaning, its own gentle pull downward into rest. The ocean continues its breathing. We continue ours, and gradually, slowly, without decision or effort, the two rhythms align. The water's rise becomes our inhale. The water's fall becomes our exhale. The boundary between body and ocean, between self and water, between the one floating and the medium of floating, softens until it is barely there. We are held. We are carried. We are moved by something larger than ourselves, older than ourselves, patient enough to hold us through whatever comes next, and what comes next is the long quiet, the space where words stop and sleep begins, where stories dissolve into the formless awareness that precedes dreams or follows them, where Atlantis, which has traveled with us through this entire journey, finally releases us into the same water that released it, the same patient covering, the same gentle transformation from solid to dissolved, from visible to invisible, from something with edges to something without them. The water moves, the stars above hold their positions, and somewhere in the space between surface and depth, between remembering and forgetting, between the world of names and the world without them, we find what we have been approaching all along. Not Atlantis, but rest, deep, complete, the kind of rest that requires no waking, that asks nothing of tomorrow, that exists only in this moment, floating in darkness, held by water, breathing with the rhythm of something ancient and true and utterly indifferent to our small concerns. The ocean breathes. We breathe with it, and the night, which has no interest in ending, continues, gently, patiently, holding everything that rises in the certainty that it will eventually fall, and holding everything that falls in the certainty that something someday will rise again. But that is not our concern now. Now, there is only this: water, darkness, the slow drift, the feeling of being held without being held to anything, the release of all questions into the quiet that follows questions, and Atlantis, which we sought, which we contemplated, which we allowed to teach us what it could teach, sinks one final time, not into the ocean, but into the deeper water of sleep, taking with it the temples and rings and carefully placed stones, taking with it the story and the searching and the questions that have no answers, taking everything, until what remains is only the rhythm. In, out, rise, fall, the water breathing, us breathing with it, and the long, patient night continuing.